All right, this is the Facing Fiction podcast, episode 1. I'm Ethan.
I'm Trenton.
And I'm Noah.
So today we figured we would do a retrospective on the Spider-Man franchise as a whole because at the time of this recording, we are 5 days away from No Way Home, a movie that, it's been a long time coming. We've been looking forward to this movie for well over a year now. The
crazy rumors.
The hype
is insane.
The trailers look amazing.
I don't think I've ever felt this much hype for a movie. The closest I think we could get is Endgame.
Yeah.
The hype for Endgame was real, but I think No Way Home just is a little bit more because of the,
a lot of the nostalgia factor to it.
Emotional factor
Exactly.
of it all. Because, of course, if you all are unaware, the rumors are that Tobey Maguire and of course Andrew Garfield.
It's the rumors surrounding all that that's getting the hype in there.
It just seems like it'll be a combination of no matter what franchise of Spider-Man that was your favorite, it seems like it will please people from all different generations.
Well, it's just really interesting because, Trent and I specifically have always talked about, of course, Spider-Man 4 never happened. The Sam Raimi trilogy, as we'll talk about later, has just meant so much to, I think, all of us. And Spider-Man 4, of course, never happened. And we've just always talked about, what if it did happen? And it was always just kind of a pipe dream. Of course, it was a what if.
Yeah, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Let's jump right into it, and let's start off with the 2002 Sam Raimi's Spider-Man.
Of course, something I wanted to talk about with this first Spider-Man movie was a lot of people kind of talk about what was the first comic book movie to really set the stage for the modern era of comic movies that we have today. I think it was this movie was the first Spider-Man. A lot of people say it was that first X-Men. A lot of people say it was Blade.
Blade's a close one too, yeah.
I'd say X-Men and Blade definitely, they deserve their own merits as of what they did for the way people perceive comic book movies and that they could be made on that big of a scale. But Spider-Man is really what, it had the biggest opening weekend of all time when it first came out. And I felt like it definitely was the big one to resonate the most with audiences. Definitely a lot more so than the Blade movies or the X-Men movie that had come out beforehand.
Well, that's what I was going to talk on because of the opening weekend. It really set the stage, I think, for the comic movies. And really, Sam Raimi had an impossible task, which was how do you take these Spider-Man comics and put them into movie format? Of course, the X-Men did it before, but I think as corny as that first X-Men movie is a little bit, it still was a little more grounded than this first Spider-Man movie. And, that first movie really embraced, the camp of the early comics.
Let's discuss where we want to start with this. We want villains, Spider-Man's a hero, Mary Jane. Where do you want to start with this first film?
I don't know, just talk about what works.
Well,
with
what this movie, for me, what it means to, I can't remember, I was born in the year 2000, so I really can't remember a time in my life that I didn't have these first two Spider-Man movies. And I just remember it was a movie that I felt like...
Cut from 4:37 to 4:45.
I'll start. Watching, because I did marathon these movies, and something that I did know, admittedly, this first one, it's corny, it's cheesy, it doesn't hold up as well as other comic movies do, especially from around this time, but much like the first X-Men movie, both of them I think are very similar. They're both very corny and cheesy, but I can forgive it because it was a first of its kind, and really, this movie was very true to the comics of the 60s.
They tried to be, yeah.
And that's what I was going to say too. I think it took the best elements of ripping stuff straight out of the comic book material while also giving it a mixture of just feeling like this is a real world that these characters are being put into. And so that was probably another very challenging task that this movie had to pull off, like being able to be taken serious but also stay faithful to a lot of the silly silly and cheesy somewhat source material, even though not to discredit it whatsoever.
Well, you're talking about being faithful to the actual source material, and that's kind of why Sam Raimi was chosen in the first place. You know, they wanted a director who was familiar with the comic books, who knew what he was doing, knew what it should and will look like. And Sam Raimi had all that experience. He's done a lot of comic movies, not before this one, but had a lot of experience reading them, loving to read them.
He did Darkman, which I think was based off of a comic, but it was, I think I read that he was chosen because he was very familiar with the material, like you said. He had a lot of the Spider-Man comics, but I think it's worth noting the history that this movie had, because they have been trying to make a live-action Spider-Man movie since, I believe, the 80s. I mean, at one point, James Cameron was supposed to make one in the 90s with apparently Leonardo DiCaprio.
That would have been interesting.
Of course, it's never concrete if Leonardo was the consideration for it, but it probably was. It's James Cameron. He did Titanic. I mean,
up until 2002, all you had was the 70s TV show Spider-Man.
Yeah.
That's it. So this was like
and I think it's safe to say, you know, even at the time that came out, that wasn't anywhere nearly the phenomenon that Raimi's trilogy was when it hit audiences.
Exactly.
Of course, we have to bring up Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin.
Oh my God, what a hero. I love him.
Well, it's so interesting because Willem Dafoe himself has said that he really fought to get that role. He really wanted it. And he's talked about how people around him were telling him, or were kind of judging that, like, oh, why would you want to do a silly comic book movie? But, you know, that's what I love about Willem Dafoe, is that he's not one of those actors that thinks he's above a comic book movie or anything. You know, if he loves a role, thinks it's interesting and fun, he'll do it. And I think he killed it. It's the perfect choice, honestly, for the Green Goblin.
Honestly, yeah. Willem Dafoe knocked it out of the park. I mean, I couldn't think of a more iconic villain with Spider-Man, his number one nemesis, practically. And then bringing him into the very first movie. Although, in retrospect, I mean, it does look, like you said, campy at times and a little comical. With the costuming especially, I mean, it was done fairly well, in my opinion.
You know, there's actually unused footage of what they were originally going to go with that Green Goblin costume, with an actual mask that moved, the mouth moved, and it looked very more comic accurate to like a goblin face.
Yeah.
Which would have been interesting to see. The costume, I love the mask, but the suit itself was very corny.
Yeah, exactly. The suit was corny. Remember he had the, what was it, the Nike... air boot, what was it, on his feet? It was
some name brand shoes.
Some name brand shoes. They
sprayed true NYC villain.
They put some just plain ass little arm pieces on top of them, sprayed them neon green, and just put them on him.
But he did all his stunts. He did all his own stunts too. He practiced with a harness on the glider and everything.
Yeah. So why does Tobey work so well? Why do we think he was cast so well?
Well, I think all of us would probably agree that, you know, Tobey Maguire is our childhood Spider-Man. He's our favorite Spider-Man. And
of course, we're biased.
Yeah, of course.
It's the nostalgia of the whole scenario.
Well, not just that, but I feel like he brought something to the role, and not just his performance, but maybe a little bit more like of the way he was written. This was a guy that, you know, you could really feel for. I think everybody has related to a lot of the struggles they went through, whether it came to, you know, just aspiring to be with Mary Jane or just having financial issues. It just made him a lot more grounded of a character, and it touched on these really important traits of his character from the comics that, you know, the other two iterations of Spider-Man, they had like little moments, but I feel like these really hit home the most in these movies.
But yeah, back on Tobey, I mean, I kind of grow up. There's nothing you can't see yourself within his character. You know, the flaws of being a high school loser, kind of. I mean, he's struggling to get to the bus. He can't get the girl he wants. He doesn't have the car, which is what sets him on that track in the first place.
Of course, we'll see in the next movie his problems really kick in, and I guess we should talk about Mary Jane and like the relationship, which I gotta be honest is one of the weaker factors of this trilogy. Is the relationship with him and Mary Jane.
Not only the relationship, it's just the lack of development within Mary Jane herself as a character.
I would say for this first movie, I really felt like they did a better job with her character for 2 and 3. Just in my opinion, you can kind of see more of where she's coming from and what she wants. In this movie, she does feel kind of like a plot device.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. Other great things that I do love about this is the end fight with Spider-Man and Green Goblin when he's just punching him. It is brutal.
Especially for PG-13.
Yes.
It pushes the limits, definitely. I mean, it's like Tom Holland said recently in an interview that one of his favorite things from the original Sam Raimi trilogy was the fact that Toby's suits always get beaten up and torn up, and they show how he's physically taking a toll. Compared to MCU, they always don't get cut up very much. It's always pretty clean.
True.
Well, I just feel that this is an underrated scene. Not a lot of people talk about that end fight with... and that's what's so interesting is that this movie, as corny as it is for the most part, the end, it's brutal and raw and, like, not corny at all.
Oh, yeah.
No, it really does show. I mean, it's fun and games when he's Spider-Man, but it shows kind of how serious this is and how much of a toll it can take. I mean, and looking at the way that it ends where, Norman dies, and it kind of sets up the guilt that Peter has to go on without telling his friend, who's Harry, who means so much to him, that in a way he was there when his father passed.
Right. I mean, one aspect I like to look at a lot is just that the fight scenes get progressively darker and darker. If you notice in the movie, one, they're jumping around on parade balloons at one point, and it's kind of a little silly in nature, but
it's fun.
Also throwing pumpkin bombs, blowing people up and the skeletons, and then you get to the burning building fight, which is a little more serious, and then you get finally to that on the bridge fight, where you choose between the kids and Mary Jane, and suddenly it gets really dark and it's brutal.
And another more serious element of this movie is the arc that I would say Peter has, from the beginning, trying to figure out who he is, and when he goes to, the last thing that he says to Uncle Ben, when he says, "I know I'm not your father," and he says, "Stop pretending to be," and how the movie comes full circle at the end where he is able to become the man that he knows his uncle would be proud of, and he says, "I had a father, his name was Ben Parker."
Right. So we've talked a lot about Spider-Man 1 and just overall thoughts on it. Let's move on to Spider-Man 2 now.
I kind of just wanted to close, the first Spider-Man, overall, I think, as a first effort, doing a Spider-Man, it had never been done before, so I think as a first effort, it was really good, and like we said, biggest opening weekend, so it was very successful, and I don't think anyone really could have expected the amount of success that it had at the time.
And my opinion too, even regardless, first effort or not, I still really enjoy this movie, and I still think it's a lot better than a lot of comic book movies we get nowadays.
Yeah.
Of course, just 2 years later, Sam Raimi comes out with Spider-Man 2, and this is a position... I've already said, I don't empathize with the position he had for the first movie, but how do you go about the second movie? People love your first one. How do you top yourself? Well...
And not only did he find a way to top himself, he knocked it out of the park. He
exactly
did the impossible. He was able to make not just a great sequel to a comic book movie, but this movie just had layers to it that I don't think anyone really expected, especially going off of how some of the first movie had elements of campiness and, just being all around kind of corny and cheesy. I feel like this movie, in a way, just did away with almost all of that. There still are, fun, goofy moments, but yeah, this one definitely took itself a lot more serious. Are we gonna cut there? because we knocked something over.
Yeah, we can cut.
Yeah, let's cut.
We're at 17:37.
Yeah, this movie really showcased Sam Raimi's understanding of who Peter Parker is, and the thing, like, of course this is a great Spider-Man movie, but it's also just a great character study in a man versus self story. The entire, it's just a great character arc for Peter, because in the first movie he becomes Spider-Man because his uncle told him, with great power comes great responsibility, the guilt that he felt for his uncle. Whereas this movie, because let me backtrack here. The amount of shit that happens to him, it's you as an audience member have to ask yourself, why would anyone want to be Spider-Man when he can't? He's getting bad grades. He can't
hold down a job. Can't hold down a
can't
job.
hold a
He's too busy
job.
saving people.
He can't see Mary Jane's play because of this responsibility that he has.
He carries the guilt for his uncle's death and basically leaving his aunt alone.
He can't be the person that he truly wants to be because Spider-Man takes up way too much of his life.
And that's what's great. This movie asks that question. Why would he want to be Spider-Man? And the answer is he doesn't want to be Spider-Man. Because who would in this kind of situation? And the journey and the arc that he goes through is him wanting to be Spider-Man, which is, of course, is the arc at the end of the movie, is that he's not doing it anymore because he feels he has to. He does it because he wants to. And that's just what the great arc of this movie really.
A movie like, think about all the comic movies that came out before this, or even Spider-Man 1. I mean, none of them had the emotional resonance that this one carried with it, which is honestly very impressive and unseen before in any movie involving superheroes, because nobody thinks of them like that. They always think of the bright shining hero can do no wrong. If they're a brick wall, nothing gets to them. It's seen in the comics constantly, but not in the movies enough, and this one set the stage for that.
And this was a movie where, obviously it was out before the Dark Knight trilogy had come around. I think this was really like the first of its kind to, even if you didn't really care for superhero movies, there was definitely something in this movie for everyone. Obviously it has amazing action and great Spider-Man scenes, but, like we said, it's a story about a man struggling with his own identity and, trying to find out who he wants to be. I just thought to myself, I kind of compare it to Jaws, the original one. Not that there's a remake, but if you think about it, Jaws is a shark movie at the end of the day, right? Spielberg didn't have to make Jaws as good as it was. He could have half-assed it, made some just B-movie shark movie.
Yeah.
Right, and it probably would have sold tickets. It's kind of the same thing here. Sam Raimi didn't have to make a Spider-Man movie this good. He could have just made a movie with, cool action and, stuff that people wanted to see. But no, he went the extra mile and made a great character piece.
And this was only on, when it comes to the movies, Spider-Man's second outing. He already took that big of a leap with the character, which I really appreciate, and I know tons of other people do as well.
Tell you about one of the best factors of this entire movie is just the villain, Doc Ock.
Of course, Alfred Molina did a great job.
Alfred Molina, but same with Willem Dafoe. I mean,
he was
perfect casting.
Both of them were born to play the roles that they were given in both of these movies. I think hands down, all of us could probably agree, out of any Spider-Man movie, those two in their roles are definitely the highlights of any of the villains of the whole Spider-Man franchise.
It's hard to compete with it or even compare them. They're so well done. It's hard to say, is anybody on the same level as Willem Dafoe and Alfred Molina as their villains.
Of course, Sam Raimi continued the trend of Spider-Man. I mean, what makes Spider-Man villains so great is that he connects them to Peter somehow in his life. Of course,
right.
Norman Osborn was his friend's dad, and then Otto Octavius is somebody who he's doing a paper on, and
one of his idols.
Friends.
A new role model, yeah, a new idol.
Yeah, it's just another way that he connects those villains to Peter, which I think really...
It makes it even harder to fight on. It makes him an even more emotional villain. Someone Peter does not want to fight.
Oh, and we talk about how Peter has his own arc and things he has to overcome in the movie. And what makes Doc Ock such a great villain is you can see him struggling with a lot of the same things that Peter is. You know, the whole thing about how it's his dream, everything he's doing with this machine, and he, as well as Peter, learns by the end of the movie that sometimes, that speech that Aunt May gave, that sometimes you have to let go of what's most important to you to do what's right, even our dreams. So I thought that was nice that Peter was kind of able to resonate that in the head of like one of his idols.
Because he figured it out for himself. You have to let go of your dreams. Being a normal person, become Spider-Man. Same thing to Doc Ock. You have to let go of your dreams and just be a good person and do the best you can.
Well, I've seen people describe how Doc Ock is kind of, in a way, a reflection of Peter himself. I mean, they're both brilliant people, and they're kind of just two of the same people, just who went opposite paths. Of course, Doc Ock went to a villainous path, whereas Peter went to the heroic. So they're parallels of each other. And something else about Spider-Man 2 is just that Spider-Man No More story. And a scene I love it to death, and I talk about it all the time, is the Uncle Ben scene where he's in the car.
Oh yeah.
And the Take My Hand scene. It's one of my very few gripes of this trilogy is that arc was never finished. He never takes Uncle Ben's hand,
or we never see it.
Right? We never see it. But I gotta tell you, that scene where he tells Uncle Ben, "No, I'm Spider-Man no more."
Right, make a grown man cry. Honestly,
tears to the eyes too. Oh my god!
Such a tearjerker scene. I love it so much.
I can tell you one of the favorite scenes of mine is just, I guess you say the opposite of a tearjerker. It's edge of the sea, like shaking. It's the horror put into this movie by Sam Raimi, very known for the Evil Dead series he made. He has a horror background. He knows what he's doing. And that scene with Doc Ock, he was just transformed with the accident. He's on the surgical table, and the arms start wreaking havoc, throwing people left and right.
Easily one of the most iconic scenes in for comic book movie villains, let alone just comic book movies in general.
It's a scene that establishes the threat. Every kind of comic movie, you need to establish the threat, and that scene does it.
Why should they be feared? Why should the audience fear them?
Right, and the arms just brutally murder these doctors who have done nothing wrong.
And that's just another thing on this movie, just doubling down on the seriousness. We have, in the first movie, as much as we love it, Willem Dafoe saying back to Formula O, turning people into skeletons, but the way that he gets introduced as a villain in this movie, just horrifying.
Right.
I love. Okay, we gotta talk about a scary scene. But I love just the amount of humor and memes, especially that have been born from this movie alone. Out of all three of them, there's a lot of good lines, but the Doc Ock memes are classic.
Oh yeah, the Raimi movies are infamous.
Yeah, Sam Raimi has a very unique sense of humor, and I think it works for this trilogy.
It works well.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Of course, we can't talk about Spider-Man 2 without the train fight.
Oh, Jesus. Oh, yes.
So apparently this scene was planned long before the script was even written for this movie. So they planned this scene, like, from the big... Well, because Sam Raimi actually originally wanted Doc Ock to be in the first Spider-Man movie alongside Green Goblin.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think... the train fight was just an idea.
That? Oh, I guess we're getting it. No Way Home.
Yeah.
Right. Finally, it came full circle.
So, this was a long time coming, I think, for Sam Raimi to put the train scene in there. I think he always wanted it. Just the idea of a train. It's a great concept for an action set piece.
Even though it's 2004, it still holds up to this day. I think it just always will.
Beautiful.
And it puts Peter in interesting problems that he has to solve. Like when Doc Ock throws him off the train, he has to use cars to sort of, pull him towards the train.
When he's chucking people off the train out the windows, he has to catch them all. It's to stop the train. It's to save his grandma.
Unlike anything...
Oh, it's Aunt, my bad.
Unlike anything that had been showcased in a comic book movie before.
It took 11 days to film. That train
fight
too,
didn't take longer. I mean, you compare it to like all the scenes they do these days. They're massively CGI. You can clearly tell. a lot
Well,
of the time.
it's
This
interesting
one,
you bring that up.
can't quite.
Right. Well, that's an interesting point. There is a lot of CGI used in this movie, don't get us wrong, but the thing that I love about Sam Raimi and his filmmaking is that CGI will be used, but immediately after, he'll cut to a practical shot. So you don't notice the CGI as much
Right.
because he's always cutting back to practical shots. He only uses the CGI when it's necessary.
And while we're on the topic of the train fight, obviously the action, the way it's stylized, it's amazing. But I always remember when I was, growing up as a kid, I always was very confused by the scene when all the passengers on the train bring him in and his face is revealed. I always thought, oh, that's kind of weird. Somebody would tell somebody about that. But
Right.
that is another thing about this movie that's gotten better as I've gotten older. Just Sam Raimi really made the city of New York, especially in this one, its own character.
It's humanized very well.
Like, you have a lot of little, quirky stuff, like, whoa, he stole that guy's pizza, and go, Spider-Man, go.
Of course, the pizza time.
Oh, yes.
I'm
But
surprised we didn't
pizza
mention
time.
that
I mean, wait,
line, the
how we skipped
iconic
that
line.
one?
But, the scene where they all see him unmasked, it shows, even with the slander that goes on from J. Jonah Jameson in the Daily Bugle, and
Oh,
all
how
this
can we
stuff,
forget J. Jonah
that
Jameson?
Spider-Man...
We didn't mention him.
True.
How
That-
dare we?
Spider-Man brings together the best of all of us because he's such a relatable character, and I think that's really showcased on that scene when they all pull him in and they all make that promise to him out of just gratefulness for what he's done and just what he means to them, and also kind of shows what he means to just us as an audience.
Speak the time. Well, we were talking about perfect casting earlier with the villains. But what about J. Jonah Jameson? Oh my!
Probably
we just
one of
he's
the
still
most
around
perfect
today.
comic book castings. I mean,
So perfect he came back again for the new MCU. I
Yeah.
missed him dearly.
no, yeah. I think it was that they just had to cast, because who do you really replace
There's no way to do
with
it.
that
You gotta-
character?
if you wanna
In the
be
Amazing
fantastic-
Spider-Man series, they didn't even do Jameson because, I mean,
They
what
didn't.
how can you recast
Yeah,
that character?
I think they were scared.
Yeah, yeah.
For
They
good
were
reason.
worried.
Right.
There's a lot of backlash online.
Right. So,
Closing thoughts on
Oh.
Spider-Man 2.
Yeah.
I mean, easily top 5 favorite comic book movies of all time for me.
and it's just one of those movies where, what can you really say that just hasn't already been said? It's
yeah.
great. It's amazing.
Well,
Sam Raimi outdid himself.
Favorite scene from the movie? Is it train fight?
Oh, it's
Both of
trade
you guys?
fight. Trade fight.
I think it has to be the train fight.
Yeah, I mean, probably the train fight. But, like we were saying earlier, this really was a character study on Peter Parker. So, some of the best scenes of the movie are obviously ones that have nothing to do with him while he's in the suit. The
yeah.
speech that Aunt May gives him.
Got the
is-
drops.
Very inspirational.
Very inspirational speech,
Yeah.
and it stands out to me as just one of the most emotional moments in any superhero movie I've ever seen.
We could go on and on about this movie. There's nothing but good things to say. It blows us all away. But let's
What I'm
move
looking
on
forward to is to
Spider-Man
get to the one
3.
that's going to be controversial,
This
which
one's
is Spider-Man
a
3.
tough topic because it's not Sam Raimi's fault.
So now we move on to Spider-Man 3, which came out in 2007. And right off the bat, we know that this was not the best received Spider-Man movie. Even to this day, it still gets a lot of flack. Just right off the bat, what are your general feelings about the movie before we dive into it?
I'm curious about you, Noah.
Man, I'm always the one singled out here. It was not the best received, nor is it. It's my least favorite of the 3 from Sam Raimi, easily. It's hard to say it because it had a lot of potential. Of course, studio interference was always the number one victim blamed for the way this turned out. There's really good moments. Some of the lines are hilarious. Some of the Venom scenes when he's on the ground, they're too funny, man. To be
Venom
taken
on
seriously.
the ground.
Well, when he's on the ground wearing a suit underneath his regular clothes, what I mean. With
Oh.
Peter Parker.
Oh, okay.
It's just goofy. So it's definitely, I'm not a huge fan of it, but I still love it though.
Here's a hot take for me.
You're not a huge fan of it, but you love it?
Okay,
I love
what is it?
Spider-Man
What is
3.
it? What is it? I love certain aspects of it. The fights are really good. Some of the Harry and Peter dynamic is awesome. It's honestly not a bad ending to the trilogy, although we wish it hadn't been.
You know, for it being a movie that wasn't supposed to be a conclusion, it did a pretty good job of wrapping things up.
Job, yeah.
But Ethan, go ahead.
No, I love Spider-Man 3, actually. In fact, I would go as far as to say, this is my hot take of the day, that I think it is better than the first one. As far as the movie goes,
Take it back.
I really think people overreacted to Venom.
I'll do you one better. It is, out of all the Spider-Man movies, now, don't get mad at me, but it is my second favorite Spider-Man movie.
See,
I love this movie, and I think that I guess I'm not the biggest Venom fan, so I guess that's kind of where this. I don't
cut.
We gotta repeat
You part?
Yeah.
Oh.
33.
Okay. Let's compose ourselves.
33, 32 to 33,
Get the giggles
50, please. Alright, 3, 2, 1, Ethan.
So, I love this movie. I guess I wasn't the biggest Venom fan from the comics, so I really didn't see. I think people these diehard Venom fans. Yes, Venom in this movie was not what I think people were hoping for.
Yeah.
I personally think he works for the Raimi world. He works as this great, opposite of Peter. Like, Topher Grace's performance, he is so much like Peter. It's as if Peter lacked any empathy and, care for people. That's, how Venom was.
So, kind of, you look at it as if, let's say Venom wasn't a beloved comic book character, and our first introduction to the character was in Spider-Man 3. Like you said, I agree. I think he works for this universe. I can understand why a lot of people were upset. They wanted a more comic-accurate version of Venom. He does feel a little shoehorned, but I find Topher Grace in the role very entertaining. I had a good time. And this might... Another hot take here. I do really like the design of Venom at the end of the movie.
It's not bad. The end of the movie, it looks really good. And I like what Ethan said, where he brings up Topher Grace's character is honestly a parallel to Peter Parker himself and Tobey Maguire. They look very similar, same build, same shape, same body type. They both photographers act the same. Just one is less empathetic, more narcissistic, and just lacks those qualities that make Peter a hero.
If you take a lot of the personality traits Peter has, but you take away the important people in his life, like Uncle Ben and Aunt May, Peter could have easily turned out to be somebody like Eddie Brock.
Right. I mean, the thing is, so Sam Raimi's... The theme of this movie is really about... number one, it's about revenge. It's about forgiveness. But it's also about... The idea around this movie was Sam Raimi wanted the black suit to be Peter giving into his ego and his selfishness. Sam Raimi has talked about this in interviews, and you can really see that. And I think Venom is a perfect personification of what Peter could become had he continued on the path that he was throughout this movie. And something else I really stress here is that people give Mary Jane a lot of flack in this movie.
So let's get into that then. Let's get into that. Mary Jane, the issues with... first movie, we talked about it, acceptable, okay, for the setup and what it is. Second movie, she's love interest. There's a lot going on with her and Peter's love for her, but the third movie falls short for me.
Well, one thing we forgot to talk about when we were discussing the second movie, up to this point, I felt like in the second movie they gave Mary Jane a lot more room to breathe. We understood why she was being so cold to Peter, even though at points, some people may not agree with everything that she, was doing or saying or her actions, but you really did see from her perspective, this is a guy who's not taking her serious, and he is putting Spider-Man before his relationship and his commitment to her. So we do see where she's coming from. So I felt like by the time this third movie came around, she was a lot more fleshed out than she initially was just from that first movie alone.
She was more fleshed out, but it seemed like each movie, she's just the damsel in distress. She's screaming for help.
I mean, I would agree with that, but I think people kind of give her a bad rap in this movie, but you really have to understand, where her character's coming from. Peter, she's having issues with her play. They've fired her. She's got all these problems, and she's talking to Peter about it, and all he can think of is,
Spider-Man.
get back on the horse. He can't. He's just clouded, I think, with the ego of it all.
Something that just occurred to me? The position that she's in this movie is very similar, and I don't know if this was intentional, but it's very similar to where Peter finds himself in that second movie. He just keeps getting knocked down. It's just
over and over
thing
again.
after thing after thing, just knocking him down. I feel like Mary Jane in this movie.
And there's no one there to pick him up in Spider-Man 2 except himself, and it's kind of the same thing here. Mary Jane is trying to get Peter to see it and have him, pick her up, but he's not even there for her.
Right. I don't think the criticism of Mary Jane's character, I don't think is as fair. I think she was very fair, the feelings that she felt, was going on.
It made her feel she was real. She
Right,
was real.
right.
I just don't care for the whole her and Harry, and then the I love you, I can't be with you, I want to marry you, but you can't. Very triangular love, and it's kind of.
Well, the stuff with Harry,
overdone.
it's the Harry with amnesia, because they had to write him out of the movie for a moment because you had to focus on Sandman, which we'll get to, Sandman, which I actually have a lot of good things to say.
Well, let's stay on
about the
Venom,
Sandman
though. Sorry, Harry. Let's stay on Harry. As
Harry, this was the payoff to a 2-movie arc. I really felt like Harry should have been the main villain of this movie, and I think that's one of the flaws of this movie is that they didn't focus more on him. Of course, I'm not a fan of the new Goblin design. I don't think they should have gone with that. Yeah, I'm not crazy for that design, but it's just kind of a missed opportunity with his character.
Exactly. He should have been the main villain.
Well, as we said that we still love this movie, but I think we can understand that, as any movie, it does have its flaws, but just the amount of greatness in it from our perspectives, I think that makes us a little bit more willing to overlook some of those things. Like what you guys were saying about the design of Harry's new Goblin suit. I didn't love it, but at the same time, it didn't bother me too much. It didn't ruin the movie for me.
It didn't.
And
that opening fight with Peter and Harry, that's probably, of all 3 movies, the best opening scene in my opinion. That fight is awesome. I mean, it's epic. It's chasing for the ring. They're flying around. This is the first time he's fighting Harry, who he thought was his friend. It's just going off.
He's going off.
I like it. It's good.
So Sandman is in this movie.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that Sandman was Sam Raimi's choice he wanted him to be the main villain of this movie, which is very interesting to me because Sandman in the comics was never like a big threat. I mean, he was just kind of a goon. I know he was part of the Sinister Six, but it's just very. I mean, I know he did want Vulture too, but when that didn't happen, I guess he settled on Sandman.
What I like to go back to, Ethan always tells the story of talking to his dad about Spider-Man villains, and I just remember his dad's a longtime comic book reader, and even when it was brought up that they were going to do Sandman for this movie, obviously he knew who Sandman was, but like Ethan said, he wasn't as big of a villain as, say, someone like the Green Goblin or Doc Ock, so he would always say, like, Sandman, who the hell is the Sandman?
Well, he talks about, so, I guess to clarify, my, when Spider-Man 3 was coming out, my dad, he, bless his heart, he tries to keep up with this stuff, but he just told me how, he just remembered thinking, who the hell is the Sandman? I mean, it's true, though. Sandman is one of those, he's not the villain I would go with to headline a movie. So it's very interesting. But for what he is in this movie, I think
he's coming back.
He's coming back. And you know what? I'm actually very excited to see. And apparently Thomas Hayden Church, who I think is a perfect casting for Sandman. I mean, they just really threw it out, nailed it with the castings of these characters.
Comic book counterparts. They really did. Besides Topher Grace, they really do.
But I think Sandman is very well written in this movie. He's very sympathetic. You really do feel for him. He's not just some thug.
He doesn't want to do.
Doesn't like Spider-Man.
And I think maybe even more so than Harry, he kind of adds to the theme of this movie about revenge and forgiveness more so than all the villains have their own arcs in this movie that do relate to the theme of revenge and forgiveness. But I think Sandman more so than any of them because of the revelation that's made in the movie about he is Uncle Ben's actual killer.
Right, which is a retcon some people didn't like. I don't mind it. I love the. I mean, that's just their way of connecting Sandman to Peter, which I do like. It gave us a very good scene where Peter talks to Aunt May about.
When he originally thought he had killed Sandman.
Well, it's a good focus. That's at the point of the story when Peter has just now been kind of consumed by the symbiote and really growing into his ego and selfishness. He just finds out, okay, Sandman is the actual killer, and that's when he lets his rage loose for the first time in that subway tunnel fight.
Mm-hmm.
Really
great scene. That subway fight.
Just something about Sam Raimi and train fights.
Not just that. If you
notice
notice
for us
in that subway, there's a scene where they're falling, they're punching each other. He loves those shots where they're falling and punching each other. He did it in Spider-Man 2 with Doc Ock. He does it later in this movie with Venom.
There's one
Peter.
scene with Harry and him too.
Yeah, he loves those shots. I love them too. So I'm not complaining.
Good fight scene, but. Sandman, very sympathetic. Again, is a lot of the characteristics you see. Like he doesn't want to do what he's doing. He's saddened by what he's happened to Ben Parker. He doesn't want to have to steal for his daughter, but it's the situation.
The only villain I think in this whole trilogy you really can't empathize with would probably be Eddie Brock's Venom. Like all these other characters have pretty good motivation, or you feel something for them. This guy, he's he's a little bit of a prick.
Right.
He was just thrown in there by the.
He thinks he's in a relationship with Gwen Stacy just because they had coffee. So
he's a nice guy.
Oh yeah.
When we talk about these villains, that's probably the biggest issue most people have with this film is that just the overabundance of villains, having to give them each enough screen time to actually motivate their characters and develop them, and then separate. Okay, Harry has amnesia. We're not going to focus him right now. And we're going to do Sandman.
I really don't think that's a fair criticism of this movie, though, because I don't think the problem is that it had too many villains. Because look at No Way Home. We got 5 villains.
And I guess we'll see how that turns out.
We'll see how it turns out.
Of course, yeah, we haven't seen it yet, but I'm just saying, I think this movie could have worked better for people. Just a few things, People talk about the dancing scene, of course, the emo Peter
we'll get into that,
dancing. I like that scene. I defend that scene because that is exactly what Peter Parker would do. That's how he thinks. That's what he thinks is cool. It's a very good parallel to the raindrops keep falling on my head scene.
Absolutely.
So, I defend that scene. The one scene I guess I didn't care for so much.
I already know.
Oh, yeah.
It's the piano where he's playing the piano.
Yeah.
But
now dig on this.
To be fair though, when he hits Mary Jane, I mean that was really good.
One of the realer
really
moments of
Yes.
the whole
One of the
trilogy.
realest
Because
moments
when you're a kid watching that, you're like,
oh shit,
Peter Parker just hit Mary Jane. Like,
not my Spider-Man.
well, right. Like, Spider-Man wouldn't do that. And that's, of course, the point. Like, who are you? And he's like, I don't know.
What
Like,
is he becoming?
and then that's the moment when he takes off the suit. I mean, that's...
And I want to say, as cluttered as this discussion might sound about this movie, all these issues that people say they had with the movie about it having way too much going on, I really think it was balanced out as well as they could have, honestly. Like, I didn't feel like the movie was clunky in any spots. Like, I thought it was at a smooth flow, and I wish Sam Raimi would stop being so hard on himself about this one.
True. I mean,
Right. He's done interviews where, he really blames himself. And how can you not as a filmmaker? I mean, I feel like filmmakers in general, I guess, are the biggest critics of their own work.
You're gonna see it's this film that led to the canceling of Spider-Man 4 and ended it.
Right, which we'll touch on. I just kind of closing thoughts on this one. I think this movie ended the trilogy great. I mean, of course there are rumors about a Spider-Man 4, but even if we never get it, this movie did end the series, I think, well. We have the death of Harry, which I thought was very touching, and then
Eddie Brock.
One of my favorite moments of this trilogy is the end shot of this movie, and it's just Peter and Mary Jane dancing at the place she worked at.
Absolutely, because you get the final shot of the last two movies. It's very epic. Spider-Man, he's swinging through the city, and it's very grand in scale. But this has a lot more of a intimate, personal ending to it, where we'd seen everything they'd been through, and it's just it kind of lets the melancholy of the movie set in. Picks up right after Harry's funeral. You see Peter forgives the Sandman because the revelations made about what happened that night when his uncle was murdered, and then obviously when Peter and Harry reunite and mend their friendship at the end, there's forgiveness on Harry's end to Peter. And we never truly see Peter and Mary Jane patch things up, but what's great about that last scene is we didn't really need to. We understood in that very personal and intimate moment.
I will say this movie, as controversial as it is among fans, I have such an odd relationship with it.
We watch it all the time.
We do. We watch it. Undoubtedly, it is a very entertaining.
Isn't the
movie.
end shot the song Mary Jane sang earlier in the movie?
Yes. When
Yeah.
she is working as a singing waitress, it's
oh, never mind.
The beginning of the movie, it shows her she's on Broadway and everything's going great for her, but then you get a lot more of a sadder tone towards the end of the movie.
Right, it parallels, because the opening of the movie, it's Peter watching her perform that song, and the ending, it's them dancing to it. Or,
Yeah.
It's,
exactly.
It parallels, and
definitely one of the most action-packed and at times funniest.
Of course, we'll see where I rank this movie, which may be higher than what most people rank it, but that'll be interesting.
Okay, so that pretty much wraps up
Spider-Man 3.
The
basically
Raimi
our initial
trilogy.
thoughts. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so, of course, the original plan was not to end the Raimi series with Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 4 was planned. In fact, we have storyboards of it. We know that Vulture was going to be in it.
Was it Lizard as well, I think?
Lizard. Anne Hathaway was supposed to be Black Cat. Apparently, Bruce Campbell, which I'm surprised we haven't mentioned his cameos. He was going to be Mysterio in a kind of cameo scene in the opening. And it's just kind of interesting. Sam Raimi really seemed... He really took the backlash to Spider-Man 3 to heart. And he really... he's talked about this. He really wanted to make Spider-Man 4 great because of
himself.
He felt guilty for Spider-Man 3, and he wanted to redeem himself in a way, like you said. Of course, it didn't happen.
It didn't pan out, and then of course, eventually it led to the reboot.
Well, because apparently Sony. They, behind Sam's back, if I'm getting this correct, were already working on a reboot script with Mark Webb. Actually, I don't know if he was attached at the time, but they were already planning on a backup plan of rebooting the series. Sam Raimi, he couldn't get the script together in time that he was happy with.
I'm surprised that... I still am surprised that Spider-Man 4 got canceled. Even though Spider-Man 3 did have its fair share of backlash, it made a ridiculous amount of money.
I think it
in
was
the box office.
One of the highest grossing movies of all time. I think
at
the time.
With inflation, it still is.
Right. And they had teaser posters. Sony's official Twitter announced the release date.
You've got interviews with Tobey Maguire talking about pre-production days before the movie was canceled.
What a sad sight.
But it's really... There's a lot of factors to why this movie wasn't made. Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst wanted more time with their families. They were working on these movies for a while, and I think they wanted to spend more time with their families. Sam Raimi, he just couldn't come up with a script that he was happy with.
Right. So,
and eventually, apparently, according to the email leak that happened with Sony, Sam basically said, "Look, I know you want to reboot the series. I can't get the script done in time, so just move ahead with your reboot," and then that's what leads to the Amazing Spider-Man series,
2012.
So in TASM, we have a new lead as Andrew Garfield. They came in as the new Peter Parker, and a really new take was done on him as a character in general. Something that wasn't seen before. Perhaps it was a product of the decade it was in the 2010s.
Most definitely post Dark Knight.
Yeah.
Yes.
This new Peter was a little more edgy.
This was the era where every comic book movie had to be dark and edgy, like The Dark Knight. We saw it with Man of Steel. So this was kind of that era of, which is kind of interesting because the Avengers came out this year too, and that's pretty much the complete opposite of like The Dark Knight and this Amazing Spider-Man movie. So, but
overall feelings on this movie, on the first Amazing Spider-Man movie?
It wasn't a bad movie, I'd say. It's still enjoyable. Good Spider-Man movie. Definitely a different take on the character. I like the focus on Gwen Stacy instead of Mary Jane. I thought it was different and newer. And then Emma Stone.
The chemistry was definitely a lot better.
Chemistry was
helped because they were together at the time. Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone. So
the focus on the mystery behind Peter Parker's parents. They added more story there.
I did not like that.
Yeah.
That was a element that me personally, I never really was interested in what happened to Peter Parker's parents. And if they were to ever explore that, I didn't like how centric it was to the plot of how he got these powers and that this was a conspiracy all along and like just stuff with his DNA mixed with the spiders. And it got a little messy and convoluted.
But what's your overall take, though?
I think this movie, it's got moments of greatness. I think for what Andrew Garfield's given, he wasn't the problem with this movie, but the way they went about Peter Parker, it's not, your everyday man that I think everyone can kind of relate to. He's, he's pretty cool in this movie.
He's a pretty cool kid.
And, I think the movie, it has its ups, it's got its downs, but overall, it's a very watchable movie. I don't hate it by any means, but I don't think it even holds a candle to that original trilogy.
It's interesting because rewatching these movies, I was not the biggest fan of this movie when it first came out, and rewatching it, I really don't hate it. I really don't even dislike it. I think it's a overall decent movie, and I think it was a solid foundation for a new series, especially if, in an alternate reality, this was connected to the MCU. I think it would have been a pretty decent start for the an MCU Spider-Man. Andrew Garfield, he's a great actor. I thought he was a great Spider-Man. He is a Spider-Man fan, which I think really helped. His relationship with Emma Stone, like we said, probably the best of all series. I think their relationship, which Mark Webb, he did 500 Days of Summer, so I think they really picked a good director for like the relationship side of Peter Parker, which is important to his character.
He's got a knack for those kinds of things.
Right. Some of the weaker aspects, the villain, Lizard, not terrible, but overall
nowhere near as iconic as Spider-Man villains have the potential to be.
He's just a little generic. He's just got a kind of a generic plan about turning people into lizards.
It's not quite.
It's not the actor's fault. I thought the actor who portrayed Lizard did a really good job.
Fine, yeah.
And
again, we get the same as Doc Ock. You have that this is a role model for Peter Parker. It's someone he looks up to, he wants to work for at Oscorp, right?
Yeah, he looked up to Connors, was kind of his role model.
Yeah, exactly. Then a teacher for him, and then again, it's a villain, someone who doesn't want to fight. He's trying to save him the entire movie.
And I think all those elements of the movie are pretty strong. I just going back to what's bogging it down is Dr. Connors. He's just got such a close connection to that storyline of who were Peter's parents and what was going on at Oscorp, to where anytime the movie, I think, had something really good going for itself, it always had to remind you about this subplot that I really didn't care about, to be honest.
Didn't care about, yeah.
Yeah, the parent stuff is the weakest aspect of this series. Other things I didn't care for. I don't care for the suit. I never cared for it. I just don't like the yellow eyes. I just never thought that worked for Spider-Man.
It felt obvious they were trying to differentiate themselves
which
from
is fine.
Those movies.
In fact, I actually respect the suit in that aspect because it does differentiate the Andrew Garfield interpretation, and it does look like a suit that he would just make. Mm-hmm. I just don't like the yellow eyes. I never liked the yellow eyes. I wish they were white. It would have made a difference.
What about Peter Parker do you like? Because, in my personal take, with this iteration, I like that he's much more crafty and inventive. We know Peter Parker from Sam Raimi, we know he's intelligent, he's smart, you see him in his classes in the college, but this one, it shows him crafting, inventing, making the locks, making the web shooters, and I like that inventive side of him. It shows him how creative he is.
Yeah, something that people say is, oh, well, this version of Spider-Man, he's a lot more jokey than Tobey Maguire's was too serious, which I, of course, disagree with. I think there's plenty of examples in the Raimi trilogy where Tobey Maguire did quip when it was appropriate, which is a flaw I have with the next movie. Andrew Garfield, I don't really feel like he was that much more quippy than Tobey. He had one scene where he was very quippy, but other than that, I didn't really feel like he was that much more comedic compared to like Tobey's.
No. In that regard, they kept him. The jokes didn't overshadow his version of Spider-Man in this movie. At least, not to me. That's not a problem I have with this movie at all.
No.
Each one tries to set us up as part of it, and I think jokes is one of them. Characters is one of them. I like the focal point of him being in high school for both movies almost. He doesn't graduate until the second movie, whereas Peter Parker in Spider-Man 1, 2002, he graduated right in the beginning.
Yeah, things moved fast in that first Spider-Man
This
movie.
one is in high school the entire time. I kind of like that more high school setting.
Something I do love is Martin Sheen's Uncle Ben.
Oh, yeah.
Which, of course, I love Uncle Ben from the original trilogy, but Martin Sheen actually did a really good job as Uncle Ben. He really felt like a dad.
Martin Sheen.
He really did. I think it's kind of an underrated performance from this movie.
Uncle Ben from the Sam Raimi movies, obviously, he's iconic, but, Martin Sheen just brought something to it where, Uncle Ben in those original movies, he kind of felt more like a symbol or like an idea. This Uncle Ben, it felt like somebody that we've all known a guy like this in our lives.
We can relate to audience-wise.
It's very warm. It gives you a warm, fatherly feeling.
And I know people joke around a lot about, we're going to have to watch Uncle Ben die again, but actually, when he died in this movie, regardless of any of the other problems I have, I really do admit it hit. It was a really emotionally touching scene in the movie. You felt that loss alongside Peter Parker.
Well, and the ending of the movie when Peter plays the
voicemail.
The voicemail. I thought that was a great scene. Very emotional scene. A very emotional speech that kind of not really a speech, but the last message that Uncle Ben sent him. Thought that was great. I thought they did Uncle Ben really well. Other things they did really well, the CGI, something I don't really see a lot of people talk about. ILM, I'm pretty sure, did the CG for this movie. I thought looked like the fight in the school, the hallway. That is a completely CGI.
Very
scene.
Innovative.
Right.
Innovative.
It looked great.
Just,
it still holds up today.
Putting him in a situation where, it seems like something where they thought, wouldn't that be cool if Spider-Man was fighting the Lizard in a chemistry classroom, and they just really opened up all the possibilities with the mixing of the chemicals.
Oh, I love that shot.
Just tearing down the lockers in the hallways, and Lizard using one of them as a weapon. It was pretty insane.
Yeah, now they got creative with some of the action sequences, like the sewer. Of course, you got to have a sewer fight because he's a lizard.
Yeah.
The school fight was really cool. That shot of him mixing the chemicals and showing that Dr. Connor's he's still smart. Right?
Oh, yeah. Even as a lizard.
Yeah. I love that.
What about? Gwen Stacy, I think, needs to be talked about because she's such a different character compared to the Mary Jane that came before Kirsten Dunst.
And going back to what you said about Mary Jane and all three of those original movies, what differentiates Gwen Stacy from Mary Jane was in these movies she's not at all a damsel in distress.
No,
she is helping,
fighting to help him,
just right alongside him, doing just as important things.
Mm-hmm. She's in the lab getting the sample ready, trying to load it into the contraption, trying to make a reverse agent, I believe.
The antidote.
Yeah, the antidote, literally. She's doing a lot more, whereas before it was just, Mary Jane, I gotta save you, I gotta save you, I gotta save it. Now it's, Mary Jane, you have to leave, and she wants to help him.
Right.
Doesn't want to leave
I can
at
say
all.
that, You can say whatever you want about this series, but I think the relationship between Peter and Gwen, it's the best of all Spider-Man movies. I think their relationship was really well done. I think that was really the strong suit.
Emma Stone was great as Gwen Stacy, and even though we said that this isn't necessarily the Peter Parker that we want to see in these movies, but, you know, kind of going back on what we said with, like, Topher Grace and his incarnation of Eddie Brock, even though it wasn't super faithful to the comics, I still felt like Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker, if there was no comic book material that came before and this was just our first introduction to the character, you know, I still cared about this guy. I still thought he was entertaining to watch. I thought he had a lot of depth to him, and yeah, Andrew Garfield gave a great performance.
Right.
Yeah. Overall, not a bad movie.
No, I think, like I said, it's a decent flick. I really don't think it's a bad movie by any means. It's not my favorite. I don't love it, but you know, I don't hate it either.
There's a lot worse comic book movies.
Yeah. 2 years later, we did get the Amazing Spider-Man 2. Amazing Spider-Man was fairly successful, and so we got this movie, and you know, I'm not gonna lie to you, it's my least favorite of this series. Of course, we'll get to the rankings.
So, opening thoughts then. You know.
Opening thoughts. This movie wasn't for me. I think they doubled down on the parent plot. It didn't work for me personally. It was just a convoluted plot. It's just
Very
kind of interesting because Spider-Man 3, a lot of people say was a very convoluted plot, but I think that this movie in comparison is a lot more convoluted. There's a lot going on here, and that's at the detriment of the movie, which I don't blame Mark Webb for. You know, supposedly there was a lot of studio interference, and that they wanted to add stuff in. There's a lot of trying to set up like Sinister Six spin-off movies, and
the movie had a tendency of getting ahead of itself quite a bit, and you know, it's like, you know, I think I would agree with Ethan. This is definitely my least favorite out of the Spider-Man franchise. You know, when people say that there was too much going on in Spider-Man 3, that was something that I never really understood, because I thought that was well balanced. But then I remember just when I was watching this movie, I thought this is exactly what a lot of people said the problem was with that third movie going on in this one.
Yeah.
And I don't understand, like, how did they not learn?
It's a good point you bring up. How do they not learn? Like, why do they repeat the same mistake or make it worse?
For the exact reason the franchise was rebooted.
Exactly.
Well, I'll say this. I'll say what worked. Number one, visually this movie looks amazing. Great action sequences. I think great music too. I think Hans Zimmer did the score for this one. The relationship with Peter and Gwen, I think, worked really well. They explored it even more, which apparently was the plan of Mark Webb. He wanted to explore the relationship between them even further, and I think that definitely works. I really do love the concept of the guilt Peter has for the death of her dad in the last movie, and that's what's kind of keeping him from wanting to be in a relationship with her, because he made that promise. Yeah, I think if they would have focused on that, this movie would have worked a lot better.
In my opinion, this movie, its issues stem from a convoluted plot and pacing for me. In the middle of the movie, it dips, it gets really slow. It's only about the relationship.
Yes,
Gwen
the movie is so many different things.
Although that is the best part of this movie, is their relationship and their chemistry on screen. It dips and gets really melodramatic,
and it really has the payoff at the end.
It does. It ends beautifully. I mean, it's an emotional take at the end.
Well, you know, another thing I don't really care for is the villains in this one.
Yeah,
you have Electro, who I love Jamie Foxx as an actor.
Yeah,
I think he's really good.
Amazing.
Absolutely. I would not have cast him as Electro, though. I don't think he was a good fit for this role.
Especially not the incarnation.
You've seen that character
goofy
1,000 times. A goofy loser guy who's a giant nerd. He's bumbling, buffling around.
Jim Carrey as the Riddler. I think it didn't help that Iron Man 3 came out the year right before this.
Right.
And they did the same exact thing with the Mandarin.
And so suddenly they're given all this power, and it takes them over, and they can't control themselves, and they kind of lose.
And also, Jamie Foxx, he's a cool guy. Like, why is he? Why did they cast him to play this?
Well,
this
I wasn't crazy for the design either. I know they took inspiration from the Ultimate Comics. I get that. It looked It looked a little weird.
The transformation scene with the electric eels.
Yeah, they fix his
trips, he
tooth
falls,
gap.
and he fixes
They fix his tooth
his
gap.
tooth gap magically fixed. He electric eels in this little pool. He falls in it. It didn't work for me.
It's a little absurd. Which, again, it's not that this series is
Beyond
going absurd.
No, it's all in all.
You have Dane DeHaan, who another actor I really like. I think he's really good. And I think he does a good job in this movie. But he was shoehorning in Green Goblin when I don't think he needed to be in this movie.
Even more so than Venom in Spider-Man 3.
Yeah.
Way more
So he
shoehorned.
appeared out of nowhere, and he's just, how would you describe it? Really full of himself, or really like, I'm a suave dude. Even though he just looks a bit goofy, he kind of stands out really badly.
But he kind of looks like Emo Peter from 3.
Emo
He has
Peter, yeah,
that
a little bit.
hair like kind of
And then
covering his eye.
they throw in this plot. Kind of seemed like out of nowhere. Oh, turns out you have this disease, same as your father. Guess what? Your father just died. Now you're gonna die too. And they just tell him like out of nowhere.
Yeah,
He has
honestly.
to deal with it. It drives him insane.
Thinking about just everything going on in this movie, it can become overwhelming. I get a little bit of a headache.
Well, and then you have Paul Giamatti, who really wanted this role. He's apparently a really big Rhino fan.
Rhino, yeah.
You know,
He got his few minutes of fame.
Rhino is. I mean, he's not even really worth talking about because he's barely in this movie.
Right.
I don't like the design. I don't care for the mech suit, Rhino thing. And of course, they showed the last moments of this movie in the trailer, which is a little weird to me. But just characters that really didn't need to be in here, things shoehorned in here that didn't need to be like we said. There's really good potential in this movie. Like they would have focused on the relationship of Peter and Gwen because that is the strong suit of this series, and they really should have struggled or focused on that.
I will defend some of the villains, even though they are the weakest point with that and the parent story with the hidden train and all that lab. Dane DeHaan,
I couldn't believe what was going on
I-
when he went down to that train.
I liked the inspiration because the original comic books, Green Goblin he's deformed. His skin is green. He's not wearing a costume like Willem Dafoe is. Okay,
No, that's not true.
is that not true?
No, in the comics, Norman wears a costume. Yeah.
What cut there then? Hold on, sorry. Cause I was thinking like.
Does his face not turn
I
into
thought
No.
he gets all scaly, doesn't he?
Mhm.
Yeah. There's one iteration, I swear to God, he is.
Not the original.
Maybe not the
Alright,
original.
well, let's cut there.
Sorry. Cut, re-enter at 10:20. 10:20, yeah. Go ahead.
I think if they would have... Oh, I will say this about Green Goblin, though. Of course, the ending with the death of Gwen Stacy, which... I'll give him this. The balls on him. I mean, it's brutal. I mean, she does not go out... It's... You hear the smack as she hits her head on the...
Hans Zimmer soundtrack and the hand in the web reaching out. It's a tragic scene.
And, obviously, it's not complete. It's not Spider-Man's fault she died. We know Harry Osborn, he was the one who dropped her, but just the fact that it wasn't necessarily the fall that killed her, it was the whiplash from her being caught by the web. I think that really hits emotionally, especially when they have that just the scenes of the seasons changing and Peter just not being able to get over his guilt. And one thing I've heard people bring up is, could you imagine if they ended the movie on him not wanting to be Spider-Man anymore after that? But obviously at the very end, we didn't have enough time, I felt like, in this movie for him to grieve over her death and then choose to be Spider-Man again.
It goes full circle. He's feeling bad about her father dying and him telling her, hey, you can't be with Gwen.
And I think that would have been a perfect way to end this movie, would have been for him to give up being Spider-Man if they just, if they had the balls to just actually commit to an ending like that. I think it would have been a lot more emotionally resonant.
Yeah, overall, TASM 2. I liked it when it first came out. I was 13 when this movie came out. And, I don't hate this movie, but I really don't like it as much as, definitely not as much as the other ones. I think it really missed in a lot of areas, and there's a great movie in here, really.
Overall, it's a great movie to look at, honestly, and
Visually.
Yeah, visually, it's amazing. It's cool background noise sometimes, but Like Ethan said, there's greatness in here with the romance arc. It's just too many side plots that keep bogging the movie down.
Yeah,
Well
to its
said.
detriment.
Well said. Right, moving on now. We are some big MCU fanboys.
Right.
Let's get into it.
So, briefly, Amazing Spider-Man 2 was not the success that Sony was hoping for. So they made a deal with Marvel, and we finally got Spider-Man in the MCU. This was something we all wanted to see pretty much ever since, I think, the first Amazing Spider-Man. Of course, he was introduced in Civil War. Was
That's
the first
where it
one
started,
we got.
yeah.
We saw. Great. I think it was a great introduction. Loved his stuff in Civil War,
I mean,
honestly.
right before that, the biggest fight of that entire movie. I mean, it was awesome. Steals cap shit out of his hand. Like, what an entrance, right?
Well, and also just right as he's introduced, that's only about not even a 10-minute long scene of Tony Stark at the apartment that he's staying at, and
Yeah.
immediately it just establishes who his character is. He talks about how he aced his quiz at school and just how he went dumpster diving for like an
Parts.
old DVD player, and it just shows that he's a smart guy, and it shows his living situation at home, and it shows Aunt May, and then he explains why he's Spider-Man, and you just get the gist of who he is, and they do a really good job of condensing it down to not a lot of time, because obviously there were a lot of other things going on in that movie, but they showed us everything that I feel like we needed to see to introduce that character.
So opening thoughts
For that
on,
movie.
on this movie.
Well, I want to
Homecoming.
start with the casting of Tom Holland because I think that is important. As much as I love Toby and Andrew, I think we have to really look at Tom Holland. He really is the, I think, objective embodiment of Peter Parker from the comics.
Well,
I mean,
in
right.
general, too.
Stanley has said, Tom Holland is the embodiment of what he imagined Peter Parker to be like.
That 14-year-old,
So-
a young kid
Right.
in early
So,
high school.
perfect casting right away, I think.
He really embodies that childlike wonder and naivety to the world and what he's seeing around
Right, he
him.
works as
These
a perfect
superheroes.
young Spider-Man.
He's even in Civil War. He's at the stage with he's amazed by being there at the airport, seeing all these people fighting the metal fist of Bucky and all that. You can tell this is a kid. He's
Mhm.
taking all of these punches like a champ,
Mm.
and you get to Homecoming and it's
He really did steal every scene he was in that movie, Civil
Yeah.
War.
Yeah, so Homecoming, not crazy on the title, but the movie is, really, it's MCU, right? We come to expect this kind of quality from the MCU. I think John Watts did a really good job. Very interesting direction that these movies made.
Definitely the most grounded Spider-Man movie
Yeah.
that they'd ever done.
It's literally a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man
oh
story.
yeah, exactly.
It's
exactly.
very contained and
I like that about it. It works well for him being such a small character, and a big piece that sets this one apart from the others is the fact that very little time to no time at all is spent on Ben Parker about his uncle dying, passing away. I love the quote he gives to Tony Stark at the beginning. He says, "If you could do the things I can do, help people, it's your fault. It's my fault. That's why I'm Spider-Man." It's not him saying the iconic line, with great power comes great responsibility. It's just I have to be Spider-Man.
Well, with that aspect of the movie, it is kind of something that I wish they'd spend a little bit more time on, but they didn't, and I guess you just have to get over it. Maybe they will in the future. Who knows?
I will say that I do wish they would explore the Uncle Ben stuff because it is such an important part of that
It
character.
is. We've discussed before, like with the Incredible Hulk, they have that opening montage. They don't show him becoming the Hulk, but they show in the opening credits, a montage of scenes of him growing and changing, and then the experiment went wrong.
I would have loved to have
That
seen
would've
something
been-
like that in this
That
movie.
would have been perfect
I'm all
for this
for.
movie.
Yeah, look, we've seen the origin twice.
We get it.
You don't have to show the origin again, but I just feel it just feels weird that they neglect that aspect of his origin so much. Like they just really don't mention it.
Yeah.
It's really it's almost as if Batman never mentioned his parents
they
dying.
try
It's
to
such a
avoid it.
crucial part of the character. You really cannot leave that out. So that is one of the few gripes I have about the MCU version of Spider-Man. As far as this movie goes, Homecoming, there's really few I have complaints about.
No,
Well,
overall, it's
one of
good.
the best things I think this movie has going for itself, and something that differentiates itself from the other two iterations of Spider-Man, is I really do love how a big part of this movie is what it's like for kind of an up-and-coming superhero in a world that's already just full of superheroes.
Fuck, my God, my allergies.
Let me see if we're still recording.
Fuck, sorry.
You're good.
Yep, we're good. Kind of go back on what you said a little bit.
Oh,
Let me
okay.
Start again.
Okay.
And, you know, when it comes to this movie, I think one of the best things that has going for itself that differentiates from the other two iterations of Spider-Man was it's a story about kind of an up-and-coming superhero in a world that's full of superheroes.
Right.
And I think that makes it, you know, it feels like he's got a lot to live up to, when in the other two versions of Spider-Man, it was just, you know, he was the hero that
He's
was
the only
admired
one.
by all, but like, you know, he kind of, you know, you get scenes where he feels like he has potential to do more, and he has to worry about not being taken serious. He's not Iron Man, he's not Captain America, but, you know, obviously as the audience, we know he has the potential to be.
He wants to do more. This movie, he's tired of being just your friendly neighbor Spider-Man. He feels like he's not doing enough. Because he wants to be like one of the big superheroes, and he's
Mhm.
not. He's just a kid.
And
Well-
that was really nice to see Spider-Man work on trying to prove himself for the first time.
that was good.
I was just going to mention Michael Keaton as the Vulture, which something that I love. Carrying on from the tradition that Raimi set, Vulture really feels like a Raimi villain in this movie because his connection to Peter. He's the dad of the love interest. I can't even remember her name.
Michelle.
No,
No,
Michelle's
Michelle's Zendaya.
Zendaya.
That's MJ.
Yeah.
Oh, that's her real name.
The one
Crap.
before her, right? Like he's her dad, and I thought that was great. The reveal of him being her dad, I thought was great.
Oh,
I did
his-
not see
Definitely.
that coming at all.
One of the big jaw-dropping moments of the MCU.
Yeah,
Man, Michael Keaton birds, man. I tell you.
I thought he was great as Vulture.
He did a great
It's
job.
interesting because when I heard Vulture was going to be the villain of this movie, at first I'm like,
How are they gonna make him?
Vulture's just some
modern
old
MCU?
guy in like a bird suit, but I mean,
That's
they
what's great.
did it.
The tie-in to the 2012 Avengers and the alien technology left by the Chitauri, great lead-in to how they made
Except
Vulture
the
modern.
one plot hole. They say
Well, the
8 years
timeline,
later
yeah, that's
when it
off.
was
That's
not
off.
8 years later.
All right, you gotta do.
You just have to wonder how things like
so-
that slip
Yeah.
on the editing floor.
Yeah,
but-
Even
fine,
us
really.
as audience, I remember when that scene happened, we kind of, what?
Hold up, wait a minute.
Yeah.
That ain't right.
I think starting from 2020, it would have been 8 years
Yeah.
prior. So.
But he
yeah.
is an excellent villain. Definitely, he's someone, again, he doesn't want to hurt his love interest's father, but he has to stop him. That the whole scene, him in the car with Vulture, and he's threatening him. He's
When Vulture finds out
yes.
that he's Spider-Man. That was a great scene.
You're on the edge of your seat. You're worried for Peter.
Well, yeah, that is a great scene too. And also, just the whole thing about, like, I feel like this movie, it gets a lot of flack because it says Peter doesn't have to sacrifice much. He's got a lot going for himself in these movies. But no, I mean, going back on when we said he has to prove himself in a world full of superheroes, and also he does have to sacrifice things like getting the girl at the end of the movie because he knows he's the only one in this situation who can do the right thing and take down, you know, the Vulture.
He has to leave.
What I love about the MCU Spider-Man and the Vulture, because the Vulture really, he's not evil. He's not a bad guy necessarily. He's just making a living for his family by selling these weapons. But Peter looks, because he's so young and naive, he looks at things in a black and white view. Oh, you're selling weapons to people. You're bad. I have to stop. He doesn't look at the nuance of maybe why somebody has to do that. Him being fired from the construction and stuff, right? I really like that kind of dynamic.
And
I mean, it's even the speech that Vulture gives, like, look, you're young, like, you don't understand this kind of stuff. And it's like a class issue sort of thing.
it kind of also, you know, it makes you struggle with the idea of the stuff that he brings up about Tony Stark. He's like, how do you think Tony Stark afforded to, you know, build that tower of his?
Oh, yeah.
You know, obviously Tony Stark selling weapons to very bad people until he made a change. And it really does make you think, going back on what you said, he's not an evil guy at all, but obviously what he's doing is wrong and Spider-Man has to stop him, but let's cut it there.
Pause, yeah.
No, just start it again. I'll go.
Sorry, I just...
You good?
I'm
We got one more after this.
Medicine. I know.
Let me rank them.
So
Yeah.
what do you, So, I thought about mentioning how he travels around more in this movie compared to others.
No, yeah, and I was gonna continue off of him so we can lead into other stuff. So
Let's do that. All right.
yeah, it's like you said. I love the conversation he has. You're like I said, you're young. Guys like Tony Stark. They don't care about guys like us. At the bottom. I love the motivation for Vulture. You definitely understand where he's coming from and the motivation, and I just love that Peter. He doesn't look at the nuance of it, and I like that. I like that kind of nuance or non-nuance, kind of black and white view that he has because of his age. And yeah, it's a very Spider-Man thing.
Speaking of his age, I mean, like we said before, he embodies a high schooler perfectly, and something the others never showed was just the embarrassing aspect of trying to be a kid and be popular. You see him, I'm friends with Spider-Man, I know who he is. Trying to go to a party dressed as Spider-Man. How do you deal with all this power and fame you have, but you don't have to tell anybody? If a girl you love, you have to go to a decathlon and sneak out, and you want to hang out with these girls at a pool and study and all that, but he has to be Spider-Man first. And it's really embarrassing at times, him and Ned just goofing off, maybe
Right.
Death Stars and stuff. I mean, he's a kid. It really shows.
Well,
that.
and I don't want to forget this. The scene where he pulls the rubble off. Very iconic moment from the comics.
Yeah.
I didn't expect them to do it in this movie, and I thought it was great. The "Come on, Spider-Man" moment, and
I definitely think from that point in the movie that kind of resolved everything from like when it started of him just trying to prove himself. I think that's when we knew, because we got that callback to when Tony Stark said, "If you're nothing without this suit, then you shouldn't have it."
right, and that's the moment when he defeats Vulture, gets the rubble off, whatever. That's him like realizing he doesn't need the suit to be Spider-Man. Talk about the suit real quick. I want to get this out of the way. It's one of my few gripes of this movie. I don't like the Karen stuff with the AI. It's just a little too much Iron Man. I like it when Spider-Man solves his problems by himself, with his brain.
That's true. He's very dependent on Cameron.
Well, they didn't have it in the next one, so
It almost makes you wonder, why did they even introduce it in this one?
it's just one of those things that it always
That's
kind of
true.
bugged
It's
me
not
with
his
this
second
movie
movie
is
at all.
the
It's not
Karen
in Far
thing.
From Home.
Yeah, it's
wow.
so that's one of the few things that they wouldn't have done. Would have improved this movie for me personally.
It's one of those things for me where, I wish they didn't have it, but at the end of the day, they did, and it didn't ruin the movie for me.
It definitely shows that Tony Stark has so much influence over his entire being a superhero and his costume and everything. He's doing all these gadgets and hacking into the suit, and Karen being there. It shows that the relationship there is strong, and it's everywhere and everything Peter does.
Mm-hmm. So closing thoughts.
All in all, I thought this was a great first movie for Spider-Man in the MCU. Like I said, it really...
Great outing.
Like you said, great introduction to the MCU Spider-Man, other than Civil War, if you want to count that. But
I thought the story, villain were solid. It has a lot of good, funny humor moments, and definitely a strong resemblance of being a high schooler and what it's like, and more so than other films.
So going off to Far From Home is the next one.
And this movie kind of had the task of being a sequel to Homecoming, while at the same time following up on what was done in Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame.
Yeah.
I want to start off with talking about Jake Gyllenhaal in this movie, because we forgot to mention Jake Gyllenhaal. I'm sure most people know this.
He's had history, yeah.
Was going to be, was considered to replace Tobey Maguire for Spider-Man 2, because Tobey Maguire was having back problems from doing the first movie, plus that horse racing movie. I can't even remember the name of it. But it
I know,
came
I
out
know
after
it
the
is,
first
yeah,
Spider-Man.
it did.
He did that movie. He had a lot of back problems, so he almost didn't do the movie. Jake Gyllenhaal was almost going to replace him. So it's kind of interesting that Jake Gyllenhaal would eventually make his way.
He somehow found his way back to the
Right.
Spider-Man franchise, even if it was 15 years later.
Yeah.
Good casting, though.
I love Jake Gyllenhaal. He's probably one of my favorite actors working.
Oh yeah, that's one thing that this new set of MCU movies has done with their villains. They've cast just A-list actors to be these Spider-Man villains.
It's crazy to see how at this movie with the introduction of Mysterio, they tease that he's from a multiverse, and now it's coming true now. That there actually is a multiverse. They confirmed it. Now it's real. So maybe we will in fact get more Mysterios.
Right. Mysterio is a character I always loved from when I was younger. I always thought you could just do so many cool things with him, especially those PS2 Spider-Man games. Mysterio was always in those, and they always had really cool levels, so I always wanted to see him in a movie. And I thought they did a pretty good job. I loved the scene,
when he's using the drones
right,
to, for all the illusions with Peter where he sees himself at the top of the Statue of Liberty, which, interestingly enough, there is a scene in the next one coming up. It's in the trailer.
Yeah, we don't know how big of a role it's going to be in the movie.
But Jake Gyllenhaal does a fine job. Very, an egomaniac. He comes off really two-faced. He's a friend of Spider-Man. He wants to help him. He's trying to stop these villains. And then suddenly, he gets a hold of the glasses, Tony Stark's glasses, gets a hold of the drones for real, full control. Edith, yeah. And now he's full reveal. I'm a bad guy. Tony Stark screwed me over.
Well, that's
again. Even though anybody who knows anything about Spider-Man knew that was coming, it was still a pretty nice twist to see.
Yeah.
Well, the thing that's great about Jake Gyllenhaal is he can play both. He can play that nice, warm-feeling friend.
He does.
But then can switch to that if you've seen Nightcrawler, you've seen this kind of unnerving side of Jake Gyllenhaal that he can play. So I think that does work really well for the Mysterio character.
Now, okay, so now with Spider-Man in this movie, can we cut?
Sure.
Fuck, I was going somewhere.
We don't have to actually stop. We can just keep going.
It's just so I can.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
But so I was gonna bring up how
bring up either the travel, Mary Jane.
No, I was gonna talk about how
MJ.
this
It's
movie,
actually Michelle Jones.
Yeah, MJ.
This movie had to follow up after Avengers Endgame with Peter carrying the weight of having people asking him if he's going to be the next Tony Stark.
Yep. All right.
Okay, so going back to the beginning of this movie, where it finds Peter Parker in the beginning, he's just half the universe has been saved. Everybody is looking up to Tony Stark, who was a huge character in Spider-Man: Homecoming and a very pivotal role in Peter's life so far. Everyone's looking to him and saying oh, are you going to be the next Iron Man? And you really do feel that he's overwhelmed with this idea of basically becoming somebody that everybody sees as a god almost.
Yeah.
He needs a vacation because of it. It's too much for him, so he travels out of the country. He has to get away from it all, and it's impossible for him.
It's kind of interesting the direction they went with this movie, because in Homecoming, all he wants to do is be Spider-Man, whereas in this one, he's doing everything he can to not be Spider-Man for a weekend. So it's just kind of a interesting dynamic between the two movies.
Well, and I think that that's understandable though, because there in the first movie he wasn't being taken serious enough, and he wanted to do more. He knew he could do more, and he still wanted to be a kid. You got elements of that in the first movie, even though he had to make some sacrifices. In this one, I think it all just becomes a little bit too much. It's one of those things of be careful what exactly you wish for.
Well, of course, we'll see in No Way Home, according to the trailers, this stuff's going to come head to head.
Yeah.
Doctor Strange has talked about this. The problem is you trying to live two different lives, and we've seen these two different lives with these movies. Mm-hmm. Wanting to be Spider-Man and not wanting to be Spider-Man.
Well, the biggest part I should stop right there, cut that, but one of the biggest things for Peter Parker in this movie is I don't want to be Spider-Man right now. I want to get away from all my problems, and I miss this man who was my father figure. Then also it's, can I believe in myself to have the responsibility of taking care of Edith? Because he doesn't want that. He doesn't want to be responsible for Edith and all his power. And so what he does is he gives it away, and then he instantly realizes that's a huge regret. I made a big mistake. And then you see him, all the scenes of him fighting the drones, and they're all around him. He doesn't know where he's at, what's going on. He has to rely on senses and believe in himself. That's a big part of the arc.
And a great scene that really showcases all of that, I feel, is when he's talking to Happy on the plane, and
making his
he's
new
I
suit.
do love that scene.
and he breaks down and he just tells him, like, you know, I'm not Iron Man. I don't know what people expect me to be, but I can't be that. And then Happy, you know, he gives him the boost that he needs. And, you know, I like that, because that was a big problem a lot of people had with the last movie, was they kept trying to, a lot of people saw as they kept trying to make him Iron Boy Jr., but no, it shows that he is his own person and his own superhero, and he's going to find a way himself to solve this problem without any, you know, fancy tech or anything like that. He gets in there and he uses his wits and his
he
skill.
does have his fancy suit that he
fancy
made.
suit.
With
Like-
AC/DC that they added, which was a great callback to the original Iron Man.
With
I did
this
like
one,
that.
there's no more Karen. Rather than it just being the suit, you see him actually get more creative, and he's jumping around, drone to drone, trying to stop him. He's swinging them around with an engine, blowing stuff up. He's working his way through, and finally he's confident in being Spider-Man. I don't need the gadgets. I can do this all for myself. And he takes down Jake Gyllenhaal's Mysterio.
Right.
He
No, it doesn't
supposedly
end.
does.
Well,
We'll have to see.
But
But
an important topic of this movie, though, is MJ, Zendaya.
yeah,
Much different character. You know, we've switched love interest now. The other one,
she's a new character, which is an interesting
interesting
direction.
take.
They call her MJ, but she's not Mary Jane,
Michelle
which is
Jones.
interesting. Yeah, which the relationship between them, I just don't think it's been fleshed out enough. We'll just kind of have to see to really judge it.
It's
For what we've
she's-
gotten so far, I do like that. It does feel like a genuine, awkward teenage relationship
It does,
so far.
That's a good point.
And, you know, but I still would agree. I'm not super crazy about it so far. We are going to have to see more of it. I mean, it all did kind of just come to a head by the end of this
she's
movie.
the most unique take on the character. She's not your, even like an average person. You know, she's very, very odd and kind of into weird things. Always making weird one-liners in both movies. But he has this huge crush on her, and we're seeing it develop finally in this movie.
Not very comic accurate, but once again, I think.
Well, she's
it's-
not Mary Jane though.
She's
So
not
that's the thing to
technically.
take away, is that this is a new character, so they can really go in any direction they
Well,
want.
we didn't. Speaking of new characters, we didn't mention it, but this series of MCU Spider-Man has a lot of new characters that have never been seen before. You know, Ned.
Well, Ned is
There's
from
no-
Ned is from the comics. He's Miles Morales' friend.
Well, he's saying, like, in the
Okay.
film
Yeah,
franchise.
in the
Oh,
film
yeah.
franchise, you know, there's no Harry, there's no the teachers. You know, it's all high school. You have this new MJ. None of the same love interest. You have the best friend is Ned, which is way different.
Even Flash Thompson's
Even
different.
Flash Thompson's different. Yeah.
Definitely a different take
You know,
on
even
that
though
character.
Zendaya's MJ, she's not Mary Jane. She's someone else completely different. Flash Thompson, he's definitely not the iteration we got of him from the Raimi movies or the TASM films. But I think a lot of the changes that they made for this universe, they work well
They
with
do work.
inside the universe that's established.
Yeah, I mean, overall, Far From Home, it's I like Homecoming a little bit more, which will,
Yeah.
like I said, we'll rank these at the end, but still great. Still one of the best Spider-Man movies we've gotten. I mean, it's MCU quality. I mean, this kind of stuff we expect. I mean, it's the MCU. They're great.
The
They
movie
make great
is
stuff.
it's a lot of fun.
It's a good
It's a
number.
lot of fun.
Not to mention, you know, this one had the jaw-dropping ending with the reveal where Jake Gyllenhaal, he wanted the end.
Well, and
He
J.K.
won
Simmons back
in
as
the end.
Jameson. That was
That
also
too, you know, you think, okay, it's all over. Life's finally good and he's back in New York, and here he comes to bite him in the ass.
yeah.
Spider-Man is Peter Parker. Peter Parker is Spider-Man. It's a huge reveal, and then just cut credits.
What the fuck?
What's
he says
going
that
on,
They
dude?
continued
Oh,
that
yeah.
from Homecoming, but all right, we've gone through all the movies. I think it's time we rank them.
So let's go ahead and do one by one. We'll start with Trenton, and just we'll give our rankings. Actually,
I say
hold on. Sorry. Do we want to do like each bottom?
I say what we should do is each person
Say the
like
bottom.
you do your worst, I do my worst, you
My
do your
worst,
worst, then
and
you
the
do the next, and the next. And
I like that. That works
you like
better.
that?
Don't
Yeah, sure.
don't explain it much. Just say okay.
Yeah, just quick thoughts and.
We discussed it all. Here are the rankings.
Okay.
All right, guys. So finally, here we are at the end, an hour and a half in. Let's get to the entire point of this podcast. This
Which is,
first episode was rankings of Spider-Man movies in preparation
love
for
rankings.
No Way Home, guys.
Absolutely.
we love rankings.
So we'll start with very bottom of the list. We already know what's coming here.
All right.
well, this is
So
one
we
I don't
say-
think we'll have much disagreement on.
I mean, for me, the one that's going to be at the very bottom at number 7 will, without a doubt, be The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I mean, there's just a lot going on in this movie, and just, you know, a lot of missed opportunities and just stuff that we already got into, and
Mhm. Yeah, same's gonna be for me. Amazing Spider-Man 2's at the bottom. Like you said, very convoluted. It's got a lot of great stuff, a lot of great action scenes, but it's the plot. It's just his biggest flaw. Is
Maybe the only one where we all agree again. Yeah, Amazing Spider-Man 2. Exactly what Trent and Ethan both said. All of those things came together. It just didn't work for any of us. All right, so next up, number 6 on the list.
And now, even though this is coming at number 6 for me, I still think it's miles better than The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I'm going to have to go with the first Amazing Spider-Man movie. Overall, it was a fun flick. It had some things in it that I thought was a little bit too much and just bogged the movie down, but, you know, it really did make me care about the character, and, you know, I liked some of the new directions they took, and, yeah, I mean, I definitely don't dislike this movie.
yeah. I'm gonna have to agree. Probably Amazing Spider-Man's gonna come next for me as well. I agree with Trent. This is a pretty big leap from the bottom one. I really do enjoy this movie. I could pop this in and have a good time. Good action sequences, good acting, good.
This might be an easy ranking.
Yeah.
For me, The Amazing Spider-Man sits there right at number 6. All right, so number
Guess
5
we'll
for
move
us.
on.
Wow. No. Okay,
Number
so, well, for me,
This is where it
I
gets
think.
tricky.
All right, so number 5 for me is probably going to be. I would probably say Spider-Man: Far From Home is going to sit at number 5
Man.
for me.
It's
So it's gonna be for me too.
And you know,
You
I mean,
suck.
this movie it's a lot of fun, but you know, there's just things that the 4 movies above it just, you know, they hit a little bit more of what I wanted to see in a Spider-Man movie, but it's still just loads of fun. I love this movie.
Yeah, I'm gonna put Far From Home here too. It feels weird because, as we'll see, the next one that's gonna be above this. I'm ranking it higher, more of respect out of that movie. But this one, I do love this movie. Just I love the other ones more. It really is.
Number 5 is it's a tough one for me. I go back and forth constantly. Well,
I think I know what it's going
it
to
should
be.
be Far From Home or Spider-Man 3.
Man.
I always I change my answer so many times because Spider-Man 3 is entertaining. It's good. I love it.
So what
I
is
hate
it? Your
it.
number 5?
I'd say number 5 for me is.
Oh,
I think
goodness.
at time of recording, I will say it's probably Far From Home.
Oh,
We'll
So-
we'll see that
okay.
change basically. But
Okay.
for now,
So
it's
far
From
we're
Home.
in
For
much of
now
agreement
we're all
here.
in agreement. Okay, so number 4.
okay. And you know, my number 4 is. I've got a pretty simple list. My number 4, it's probably gonna be Spider-Man: Homecoming. Actually.
Oh,
Yeah,
Oh,
I know.
oh,
and, you know,
interesting,
I know a lot of
okay.
people think Spider-Man: Homecoming is superior to Spider-Man, and I really can't argue against that. But you know, I mean, once again, I absolutely love this movie. I like it more than Far From Home. I thought it was a great entrance for Spider-Man in the MCU. It's just the top 3 on my list just did just a little bit more for me than what this one.
all right. Well, this is where we start to disagree because
Yeah,
I'm
this
actually
is
going to
where
put
it comes
Spider-Man
in.
1 right here.
Oh, no.
I can't, in good conscience, put this any higher because, as much as I love this movie and I grew up on it and I have the nostalgia for it, it doesn't age as well as some of the other ones. It's corny in a lot of areas, and it's one of those movies where I completely understand if somebody watched it today who had never seen it and said, that was a little much, a little dated for me. I can understand that, so that's why it goes here. But still a great movie, and I do enjoy it.
For me, as I said before, it's Spider-Man 3. It just didn't.
It's a pretty good spot, actually.
And not a bad spot. Again, it switches from 5th and 4th for me constantly. This movie is funny as all. Yeah, man, I love this movie. So quotable. But yeah, it just didn't do it enough for me. I thought the writing could have been better. The Topher Grace, I thought, was a bit of a letdown. I wanted more of Harry. I liked the ending overall to the trilogy that it ended up being, but number 4 is the highest I can give it.
Okay, so
top 3 then.
Number 3 for me, even though I understand what Ethan was saying about the movie being dated, it's gonna have to be Sam Raimi's 2002 Spider-Man, and I absolutely love this movie. I think it did a great blend of cheesy, corny stuff from comic books that felt torn right off the page, but at the same time, it felt like it threw those in like a real world situation, was able to give it a good mix, and we got that end fight scene was also very dark and gritty, and I absolutely adore this movie.
For me, it's gonna be Spider-Man 3. It's gonna be in the number 3. Number
really?
3, Spider-Man 3. I got another situation where I don't know if I could, in good conscience, put it above the next 2, but I do love this movie. Don't get me wrong. It's so hard to rank movies sometimes because you almost feel like you're being disrespectful to some of them. But I do love this movie. The negatives don't affect me. They don't take anything away from this movie, and honestly, a perfect ending to the series, to the Raimi series. So,
my number 3 would be the first Spider-Man, 2002.
Wow.
Honestly, a great movie. An excellent introduction. A little campy at times, a little corny, but hell, I love it. I grew up with this movie, and Tobey Maguire is my Spider-Man. This is his first film. I love it.
Yeah, and okay, it gets a little controversial here, but my second favorite Spider-Man movie, I'd be lying if I said otherwise, but my second favorite, it has to be Spider-Man 3. I know this movie has its flaws. There's no movie that doesn't, but I mean, this movie, it just emotionally resonates with me, and I just felt like it was a great conclusion to the trilogy. It brought a lot of great deep themes to the movies, and I just felt like it had a lot to add. And I definitely had some of the most hype leading up to this movie, so I might be a bit biased, but I don't care. I watch this movie all the time. I love it.
Yeah, my number 2 is gonna have to be Homecoming. I just think it's a solid movie. I mean, it's really not. I mean, we've already went through these. There's not a lot more I can really say about it. Just move on from there. Homecoming.
I completely agree. Yeah, Homecoming sits at number 2 for me. Tom Holland knocked it out of the park. I love him as Spider-Man. Civil War, Infinity War, Endgame, and now his own film in Homecoming. It works well for me. Number 1.
I wonder what our number 1 is going to be.
I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, but number 1,
God bless.
without a doubt, it has to be Spider-Man 2. I mean, not only just one of the greatest comic book movies of all time, I think it's one of all of our favorite movies. It's just got so much going for itself. It's just emotionally resonant in every way. And I think you really feel for the character of Peter Parker the most in this one.
No, actually, I think No Way Home might be my number 1. Just judging from the trailers, it looks really good.
The hype is unbelievable.
I mean, heck, surely can't be disappointing. But, no, Spider-Man 2, it's my number 1. No surprise there.
Spider-Man.
You can go on for 3 hours about it, so I'm not going to beat around the bush. It's great. It's a great character piece.
That movie is a tearjerker for me, man.
It's your number 1?
Yeah, really. Who would have guessed? Yeah, my number 1, man. Spider-Man 2, easiest decision to make on that list. There, Spider-Man 2, number 1.
All right, there you have it.
Well,
there's our ranking. There's our retrospective on the series. This is a very important series to us. We've really grown up with this. And,
looking forward to No Way Home. We'll be right back in probably a different location talking about talking about No Way Home, see if it lived up to the hype, if our expectations were right.
And then in the future, we'll have to do a re-ranking. See where does
Yeah,
No
yeah.
Way Home now
Definitely
sit
going to
on our
revisit
list?
the ranking.
Is it all it's tied up to be?
So
Right.
we hope you guys really enjoy this first outing, and I hope you guys come back.
Thanks, guys.
Alrighty.